So again, good evening and welcome to our Columbia College Women and Alumni Legacy Circle Book Talk. This evening, you'll hear from Julie Satow, Columbia College class of '96 and School of International and Public Affairs class of 2001, as she discusses her newly published book titled When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, Glamour and Power at the Dawn of American Fashion. As a way of introduction, my name is Akosia Ayin, Columbia College class of 2011, and I'm the current vice president of Columbia College Women, also known as CCW, the official alumni organization for the college. The mission of Columbia College Women is to connect alumni to the college, to one another, and to women at large at Columbia University, providing enriching experiences and benefits that support alumni throughout their lives in both personal and professional endeavors, and create an engaged and dynamic community that strengthens the voices and leadership of women at Columbia University. This event is co-supported by the Alumni Legacy Circle. Inspired by the 30th anniversary of the graduation of Columbia College's first co-educational class in 2016, the Alumni Legacy Circle was established to recognize and inspire women's philanthropy. This leadership-giving society brings together Columbia College women as leaders, elevating their voices and inspiring them to strengthen the college, expand their influence, and support the Columbia College Fund, which I hope all of you have donated to this year. Without further ado, let me introduce Julie Satow. So Julie Satow is the award-winning author of The Plaza, The Secret Life of America's Most Famous Hotel, and the forthcoming When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, Glamour and Power at the Dawn of American Fashion, which was published this month, June 2024, by Doubleday. Some amazing good news came, and that is that When Women Ran Fifth Avenue is an instant New York Times bestseller. So we can definitely give a round of applause for that. Congratulations, Julie, that is amazing. The praises are rolling in, and this is all fantastic. I've heard amazing things about the book, and I'm super excited to dive in with you. Julie is a regular contributor to the New York Times. Her work has also appeared on National Public Radio, Bloomberg Business Week, Travel and Leisure, and elsewhere. As mentioned, she is a graduate of Columbia College and also has a master's degree from Columbia University School of International Affairs. So big welcome to you, Julie. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited. It's great.
Same. So we love to kick off these programs by learning a little bit about our guest and also about your Columbia roots, your Columbia experience. So if you could just tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your Columbia journey. Love that you are double Columbia degreed up out here. We love to see it.
Yeah, I can't get enough. Let's see, I am a native New Yorker, so Columbia is the best in the city. So I was really excited to go to Columbia. My dad went to Columbia, and my brother went to Columbia. So we are a Columbia family. And my nephew is in Columbia College right now. So very cool. And yeah, I graduated in '96. And then I lived in the Middle East for a little while, and I came back and I went to SIPA. I thought I would be a foreign correspondent, which didn't exactly happen. I did become a journalist, but I didn't end up being a foreign correspondent. I stayed here. I ended up being a business journalist, and actually met my husband doing that, and he went to Columbia Journalism School. So we're all in the family. Yeah, so I definitely use my Columbia education all the time for work. My critical thinking, my research skills, so much of my writing. There was a lot of writing. So all of that, I thank Columbia for sure.
Love that. It's always great to hear other alum experiences and how it all ties us back to the university. So thank you for sharing that. And then as we get into the discussion, I think it would be awesome if you could give us a little reading from the book, just to ground us all in the conversation.
Sure. So the book, When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, is the story of the heyday of the department store. It's also the story of three women. It's nonfiction. They battled, sexism, corporate hierarchy, and very complicated love lives to become presidents of three of the biggest stores. And Bonwit Teller, Lord and Taylor, and Henri Bendel's from the 1930s through basically to the 1980s is the story. So I sort of see it as three narratives. I see it as the story of these three women, the story of the department store, and also really the story of women in work and how they entered the workforce. So I thought I would just start by reading just the first few pages of the book. So I will do that now. As ice gathered several inches thick on the Hudson River and the mercury plummeted below freezing, Hortense Odlum stepped from her chauffeured car onto the Fifth Avenue sidewalk. Gripping her felt hat to her auburn updo, she stared at the Art Deco skyscraper looming above her, at the two-story entryway made of filigreed bronze and glass, and the words Bonwit Teller etched prominently into the limestone facade. A morning rush of passers-by leaned against the gale, men lugging briefcases as they trudged toward glass-walled boardrooms, and women in nubby woolen coats ready for a day serving coffee and taking stenography. It was the height of the Great Depression, but even the ranks of the jobless seemed purposeful, huddling against the tall buildings to shield themselves from the biting cold, their bare hands outstretched in the hopes of a Christmas coin. Hortense pulled her fur coat around her and stepped gingerly through the revolving doors. At once, the scramble and blizzard outside fell away as an atmosphere of hushed grandeur and a blast of warm air enveloped her. She looked about the store's main floor with its maze of glass counters and mirrored columns, the clacking of high heels against marble echoing through the vast space as a handful of early morning shoppers wandered the aisles. Eyeing the bank of elevators sitting along the far wall, Hortense walked toward them, clasping her purse nervously as she asked the operator for the 11th floor. She exited into a reception area, behind which were a series of doors where Bonwit Teller's management had its offices. The secretary showed her to a nearby couch. Moments later, an elderly gentleman, dressed nattily in a three-piece suit with a shock of silver hair, stuck his head from behind one of the large wooden doors and waved her inside. Paul Bonwit, the 70-year-old merchant, gestured for Hortense to sit across from his imposing presidential desk, and she took her seat with a small, polite smile. Mr. Bonwit, who had come from Germany in his youth and founded his store 4 decades earlier, had spent countless hours charming wealthy housewives with his old-world manners and continental accent. But as he launched into his standard line of questioning, asking after Hortense's trip into Manhattan and how her children were faring, his typical ease faltered, and the air between them became stiff and awkward. Bonwit Teller had been one of New York's most exclusive, well-appointed department stores. But 3 years into the Great Depression, its rows of mink coats and shelves of baccarat glass sat unsold, and teetering on the cusp of bankruptcy, Mr. Bonwit had been forced to sell. The new owner, Floyd Odlum, was a Wall Street tycoon and one of America's richest men. So far, Mr. Bonwit had managed to keep Floyd at bay, holding on to his large carpeted office and his position as store president. But now Floyd's wife had made a sudden appearance, and Mr. Bonwit was confounded by the arrival of this 41-year-old mother of two. While she had shopped plenty, Hortense had never worked, and certainly not in a store. "There's a small office down the hall, Mrs. Odlum, where I hope you'll be comfortable," Mr. Bonwit finally ventured. "And by the way, my secretary will be glad to take your dictation when you need her." Hortense's face reddened. She didn't want to be there any more than Mr. Bonwit wanted her to be, but her husband had asked her to make the rounds of the store and report back on her impressions. And while she had little idea how to proceed, Hortense was willing to try nearly anything to please Floyd. "What would I do in an office?" she replied nervously. "I wouldn't know how to act in an office, and I wouldn't have the faintest idea of what to say to a secretary." As their meeting concluded, Mr. Bonwit may have felt relief at Hortense's ignorance of the corporate world. But as he took his guest by the elbow and gently guided her toward the door, he had little way of knowing that Hortense's inexperience belied an instinctive business acumen. that by the following year, their roles would reverse, with Hortense occupying the corner office at Bonwit Teller, sitting at the stately desk as her secretary took dictation, supervising more than 1,000 employees and directing a store that boasted record-breaking sales. Hortense was setting herself on a path that would thrust her into a career that she never intended, that would challenge her notions of womanhood and force her to confront difficult truths. It was the start of a journey that would lay the groundwork for an evolution of the grand department store and a metamorphosis of American fashion. Thank you.
That's amazing. Okay, so one, it's giving audiobook. Like it's giving
The
audiobook.
audiobook narrator is amazing. Her name is Karen.
Okay.
She's so good. I really recommend it. She has
I
a beautiful voice.
Well, so do you, and this is beautifully written. This is beautifully written. This is super exciting. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So we are gonna dive into some questions for you, Julie, and for our audience. Before we get started, please note if you'd like to participate in the Q&A during tonight's discussion, please enter your question, including your graduating year, into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Your entry will only be visible to the facilitator, and if your question is selected, we will ask the question on your behalf. So we've heard a little bit about Hortense from your reading, but there are three powerful women at the heart of your book. So I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah, so Hortense is sort of in the 1930s. She eventually becomes president of Bonwit Teller, as I sort of indicated in that piece I read. Dorothy Shaver was the second woman. She's probably the most famous of the three. She joined Lord and Taylor in 1924. She actually arrived in New York City as a single woman in her 20s from Arkansas, from a very small town in Arkansas. And she got a job at Lord and Taylor in 1924. And by 1945, she'd been appointed president of the store. Life magazine called her America's #1 career woman. She earned the highest published salary that we know of for a woman in business. She was a very different character than Hortense. Very, very different approach and very different personality. But she was very important and really helped establish the American fashion industry. And then the third woman is Geraldine Stutz, who was an editor at Glamour magazine. She was a fashion editor, and she eventually ended up becoming, in 1959, she took over the presidency of Henri Bendel. She was 33, very fashionable and beautiful, and she really helmed the store through the 1960s and 70s when it was kind of in its heyday, and did some really amazing things in fashion as well. So it's the story of the three of them.
Love that. So as you kind of like as you said, Hortense Odlum, Geraldine Stutz, and Dorothy Shaver, these are, the ultimate career women in retail. We all love a little retail. But it sounds like they all came from modest beginnings. Are they early examples of what grit and girl power are all about today?
I mean, they definitely they were born very far from the world of Fifth Avenue and department stores. Hortense came from a very small town in Utah. Like her parents actually were early converts to the Mormon religion, and she was like some of the first white settlers in Utah. So she basically grew her own food and made all of her own clothes, and then Dorothy, as I said, came from Mena, Arkansas, which was a very small railroad town in Arkansas, very, very different from New York City. I went there. It's very dramatically different. And the Geraldine came from outside Chicago. So she was probably closest to the big city. She was raised in a very strict Catholic household, and, pursued a very untraditional life. I should say that it is the story of these three women, but I have these vignettes spread throughout the book, where I highlight all these other women that had such fascinating stories that was kind of hard for me to leave on the cutting room floor. So there are many other women and characters who do incredible things that I discuss. So I'm happy to talk about those too, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Love that. I mean, I think that these women, even though they come from different backgrounds and different stories, they sound very relatable, especially when we talk about like women's empowerment and entering the workforce. Um, I would love to know if you could tell us about some of their influences through all the research that you've done, and also like maybe some of your own.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like they were, as I mentioned, they're very different. What was interesting to me in the research is that a lot of the challenges that they faced are exactly what we still face. I mean, it was like striking how similar the challenges actually similar, like the challenges and the stories were. I mean, for instance, I mean, they each took very different paths. So Hortense was married and had two kids. She eventually ended up hating her career and actually blaming it for the breakdown of her family life. And she really came to resent the fact that she was a businesswoman. Dorothy really leaned into being a businesswoman. She was single. She lived with her sister her whole life. I say she really like kind of like aped a male CEO. One of her closest friends was this guy, Tom Watson, who ran IBM in the 40s. So she was like very, sort of, tried to issue any like feminism or any feministic characteristics, I should say, any sort of like feminine appearances. Her clothes were very, dark and sort of conservative, all of that. Very different than Hortense. And Geraldine was kind of this super, flamboyant fashionista, very different, had, a husband for a while, although it ended in divorce, did not have children. And she was much more kind of relatable, as you mentioned, like for what we think of as a modern career woman in many ways, although she had a lot of internalized sexism and issues too. But she was most familiar because, she died in 2005. So she's the most modern of the three women. But I was saying like things felt very similar. Like it's crazy. When I was doing research, I read some article, for instance, from like, I think it was 1932, Good Housekeeping, and it was called Marriage or Career, and it was interviewing all these women, successful women, about whether they could have ever achieved what they did if they had been married, and did they think that women could be married and also have a career? So it's like crazy. That's like 100 years ago, and they're still asking the exact same question. So it was just, they had to make very painful decisions in order to be really successful in business. I think it was harder, obviously, there was less support then, but the themes are incredibly relevant to, I mean, what working women face today.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the quotes in your book is men own the buildings, but inside women ruled. Would love for you to like expound on that quote a bit. I think that's a very relevant thing to write and say.
Yeah,
Um,
so I mean, right. We all know like Bloomingdale's or Macy's, right? And those were guys. I mean, the Bloomingdale brothers and Roland Macy's, and all the stores that you've heard of are basically, Saks. I mean, they are men's names who own the buildings. But the thing that I discovered about department stores, which I didn't realize when I was starting to like research the book, is that they were really these like female universes actually. And yes, the men's names were on there, but inside the women really did rule. They ruled with the power of the wallet. I mean, shopping, like when department stores first opened in the ladies mile era in the 19th century, women couldn't even really walk down the street unchaperoned, in public. That was considered dangerous, and that wasn't something that was done. And suddenly department stores gave them an excuse to congregate in public, in these public spheres, and gather together, and they were shopping. They were able to buy things from male clerks whose job it was to serve them. So that was a big shift in dynamic that was very interesting to me. And then from the employee perspective, it was incredibly fruitful for many women, you know, at a time when it was really hard to have a career. You know, these women were able to really go up the ranks, you know, for instance, like Dorothy starting out, you know, more junior and ending up as president. That, I mean, that was unusual, but certainly like I found, like I talked about these vignettes. One of them is about this dust girl. She was in 1906 in San Francisco. She started out when she was like 12 years old, like dusting in like the China department of this department store. And by her 20s, she was a buyer. She was flying she was not flying, she was taking a ship to Paris like multiple times a year to go to the Parisian fashion shows. She was in charge of a big budget. She had a number of employees under her, and that was 1906. So you really don't think about that, you know. And like another vignette, for instance, was I have about this woman, Maggie Walker, who's really famous in Richmond, and this is like right after the Civil War. This is in Richmond, which you know is the seat of the Confederacy, and she was this amazing businesswoman who she's the first Black woman to ever charter a bank, and she also collected a bunch of other African American women, and they opened a department store, the first that we know of, you know, Black-owned department store, and it was geared towards, you know, the African American community in Richmond at a time when that was, you know, very, very difficult. And it only lasted about 6 years before all the white retailers, you know, got together and they basically forced all the wholesalers to boycott the store. And so they weren't able to make it work and they ended up having to close. But, you know, there's so many stories like that. And part of her rationale was that this was an opportunity for women not just to work, you know, as domestics or something, but they could actually have a career. So I think this was an unheralded area for women to work.
Yeah, I just want
That
to
answers
take
your
a second
question.
and yeah, I mean, when you're like while you're answering, I'm like, I just want to take a second and just shout out all the research that you did, you know, to write this book. Because it, you know, there aren't a lot of these stories haven't been told before. Um, Especially like in a way like this. I mean, just the reading that you did earlier, like I said before, it reads beautifully. You know what I mean? So I guess one, why don't you think these stories have been told before? And how did you get interested in writing about department stores, like the era of
Yeah,
department
I
stores?
know, right? Kind of random. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, none of these women have ever had biographies written about them. And so it was really challenging to research their lives. Um, Hortense wrote like an autobiography in 1937, but is actually like riddled with falsehoods. So it was really hard. She wanted to like paint a picture of herself. She was very concerned with outward appearances. So it was not really, it was like a very rosy picture. So that was actually hard for me because I had to figure out what was fact and what was sort of her fantasy. But the other two women never did. And as I said, Dorothy is like a little more famous than the other women because she helped really establish American fashion. She was the first under her presidency. Lord & Taylor was the first department store to actually name American designers. Before that, all fashion was in Paris. You did not have, I mean, the idea of American and fashion was like a total misnomer, like it didn't exist. So she helped, you know, promote all these early fashion designers. So she's a bit more famous, and there's some PhD dissertations and stuff that have been written about her, but there wasn't like a ton of material. So I used a lot of the skills I got at Columbia. And you know, should I talk about I can't remember exactly what you asked me, but I can talk about the research.
Yeah, the research, and then also like how you got interested in writing
Oh
about.
yeah. So basically, so my first book was it was it's called The Plaza, and it was a history of the Plaza Hotel in New York, but it was really, I was using the Plaza to tell a social history of New York from about 1907 to today. So I used it as a lens, and my agent was like, why don't you do Store Wars, was her idea. And I was like, oh, I don't want to do another building. I really want to do something on people. So I wasn't sure. It was like the pandemic There wasn't much else to do. So I just like kind of went down this research rabbit hole, and I was like, department stores, it's interesting. I have memories of it. I grew up in the city, like I remember them. So I kind of started doing this, and then I found Dorothy and Geraldine, and I was like, oh, that could be so great. And then I found Hortense, and I felt like the three of them, even though they never met or interacted that I know of, they like were speaking to each other. They all seemed to like build on one another and had very kind of like it was very interesting. Like I felt like the juxtaposition, and they really told the story of the 20th century through their lives. And I don't know. So that's why I picked them. And in terms of research, like, I traveled to St. George, Utah. Like I said, Hortense came from a Mormon family, and they're very big on genealogy. So they have a pioneer museum there, and they had like all this documents about her early life and growing up there. So that was amazing, and really great for resource. For Dorothy, I actually hired a genealogist because I was like really struggling to find Hortense. I was able to find her grandkids, but Dorothy, I was like struggling. I couldn't find any family members. Like I said, she was sort of a spinster. She lived with her sister her whole life. So I hired this genealogist who was brilliant, and he managed to find this great niece of hers. And I called her up, and she was like, sure, I happen to have a basement filled with stuff
Oh,
that
wow.
Dorothy and her sister left, which was like manna from heaven for
That
research.
part, right?
Yeah, it's amazing. Her sister was an artist, and so she's a really talented artist, and she also wrote stories. So she created all these scrapbooks of their life, what it was like to be in New York City as two girls on their own in 1920, the year that, women got the right to vote, how they handled it, like what they were, it was like amazing stuff in her basement, which was like helped really paint that picture. And for Geraldine, it's more like I use my reporting skills. Since she was more modern, I was able to find some women who worked for her, and I interviewed them, and through them, they found other women that they used to work with, and it was like a whole network. And I got to interview tons and tons of people who worked for Geraldine, who really helped me. And I interviewed her sister, had like 7 children, so I was able to interview her sister's kids. So, and then, like libraries, archives. I did not use Butler Library or Columbia, but I did for my first book. But yeah, FIT, all those places have amazing archives for fashion and stuff. So
How long did it take you to write the book with all the research and everything?
it took like 3 years. So I'm
Wow.
trying, I'm
Labor
hoping
of love.
I'm hoping it won't take that long next time, but it seems to take about 3 years. I haven't been able to do it in less than that. So yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, that is really like a labor of love, and it shows in the way the book is written. So I think the research piece is key. So yeah, just shout out
Yeah,
to you on
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Wanted to ask is, as you've mentioned, these are 3 different women, different backgrounds, different come ups, different experiences. Was there one character that you more closely related to, or one that was challenging to write about? I think you mentioned maybe Dorothy was a little bit difficult to write about, but were
Yeah,
there any that you
Hortense.
related to?
Yeah,
Oh,
right. She
Hortense.
was hard. Yeah, she was hard because she was like, I hated being a queer woman, and it was the worst thing ever. Which, as a modern businesswoman, whatever, writer, like working, it was really hard to like stomach that and make sense of it. And actually, like, I think I was kind of harsh with her. And I had a fact checker who I love, Samine, and she was one of the first people to read the manuscript because she was doing the fact checking. And she was like, I got to tell you, I really disagree with the way you're presenting Hortense. Like, you're not compassionate enough for her at
Mm.
all. And it's really bothering me. So I was like, oh gosh. So I rethought about that, and I did a lot of work. I reworked it, and I tried to find like more affinity for her because it was really hard to make sense of it. As for like who I felt closest to, I would say Geraldine because, she's kind of my mom's age, a little bit older. I, she feels familiar, her ideas about feminism and women and workplace, it all kind of felt, familiar. Plus, like, I interviewed, as I mentioned, all these people who worked for her, and like, they loved her. I mean, she just sounded like, you know, those people, I don't know if you've had this, but like that rare boss where it's like, you know, someone described it as like Camelot. It was just magical. Like she was so inspiring and so amazing to work for. And Bendel's in that era was so creative and so, you know, just like filled with creativity and new things and life. And she was like very, very supportive of all these incredibly young saleswomen, fashion designers. You know, she really sort of had this maternal instinct for them and helped them have their own careers. So I felt like she was the one I, you know, felt maybe most close to. So yeah, I can tell you something like cool she did. Like for instance, she did this thing where Bendel's was very small in terms of like its physical size. So it was really hard to compete with like Bloomingdale's and stuff or Macy's. So she decided she would just like open the store on Friday mornings before the store officially opened to customers. And anyone who was you know, a hat designer, a jeweler, whatever, clothing designer, anybody could line up and the Bendel's buyers would meet with them and order their stuff. Like 15% of the stuff in the store came from these unknowns who went on to become like, you know, a lot of them went on to become really big famous designers, and they were discovered that way. You know, she was really open, that which I just found so like inspiring. You know, I wish they still
It's the
have that.
innovation. Yeah, I love that. I love
Yeah.
that. Kind of similarly, would love for you to talk about any inspirational influences that you have, you know, either as a writer or maybe people that you discovered during your research of this book.
Yeah. I mean, it felt really good to write about women because I relate to it. So that was like there were so many characters that I felt like I felt a lot of responsibility to tell their stories because like it wouldn't be told if I hadn't been doing it. So that was like, you know, inspiring or kind of like, I mean, it was a lot of pressure, but it was also like felt really special that I got to be the one to tell these stories, you know. It was, you know, I realized like this, the importance of that. You know, we wouldn't be talking about Hortense Adlam, you know, if I
Mhm.
hadn't done that. So that was really cool. But like, I guess, you know, they always say that like writers have someone in their mind when they're writing. And like, it's definitely my mom.
Mm, I
Like
love
she's the
that.
person I write books for. I don't know, like she's in my head. So I feel like that's, you know, like, would my mom like it? What would my mom think about this? That's kind of the thing that's like going on with me when I'm trying to pick out material from all the different sources or figure out
Mm.
which narratives are fun or great. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of what I've got going on in my brain for some reason.
I
So
love that. I love that. I love that. We have a question from the audience. This question is from Nancy Pack, class of 1990. And Nancy wants to know, are there women who are paving the way in today's world of retail, of fashion, of the working world, who you consider influential and inspiring? Great question.
I mean, yes, you know, Vera Wang. I mean, there's so many women, you know, Diane von Furstenberg. I mean, there's incredible women that are doing stuff in the fashion world. I think that department stores per se are a different thing now than what they used to be. I mean, there is a woman that runs Bergdorf Goodman, for instance, but you know, they just don't have that same, they don't have the same role in our society as they did back then. So they're not kind of these same cultural touchstones or institutions. Um, but I do feel like, you know, I'm hopeful. I feel like people like, you know, I mentioned Vera Wang or Diane von Furstenberg. There's so many others that, you know, are obviously doing things to empower women and focus on that. You know, I actually have on my Netflix to watch the new Diane von Furstenberg documentary, which sounds amazing. I've heard like really good things about it. You know, she's so inspiring. So, but I don't know, for whatever reason, I felt like focusing on history, I don't know, it was very fascinating to me to realize that I'm part of this continuum. Like those women, like, you know, Vera Wang or Diane von Furstenberg, for an example, or me, we all stand on these shoulders. I knew like, you know, the early, like you know, the 1960s now and like you know, that movement. I knew about that, you know, from Columbia, wherever, life. But I didn't realize that like as far back as the 1910s, that stuff was going on,
Mhm.
and it was really, I mean, I'm going historical now for a second, but it was really interesting to like see how that happened. Like, the 1920s, it was like the flapper, and all these women were making all these, it was like the progressive era, and these women were making all these gains. The universities started opening, their quotas to more women and all this stuff. And then in the 1930s, there were actually like laws prohibiting the hiring of married women, and requiring, for instance, any married teacher who was a woman to be fired. There was a whole feeling like it's the Depression and women shouldn't work because they're taking jobs away from men. Then obviously, like in the 40s, we started making gains again when, it was World War II, and there was the draft, and all the women were like, great, we can go into all these positions that were open, when men left for the war front. But then obviously the 1950s was like the Leave It to Beaver era, and so it was like back and forth and back and forth. So I don't know. It was just interesting to see that process, and sort of the long view of it. I
Yeah,
don't
I
know
think it's
exactly answer your question.
when
I'm
you're
sorry, but
no, that's it. Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point about how history can go back and forth or be cyclical in some ways. And I think we're definitely seeing that now as well, in the way that things are progressing, especially for women.
yeah,
I also like on
it
a
was.
funnier note, it's like, the J.C. Penney Christmas photo shoots are coming back.
Are they really?
So
Is
maybe
that
there's
true? I didn't even
yeah,
know
it's like
that.
it's like a
Okay.
thing. It's like a thing on TikTok where people are literally going into the few JC Penney's that are still open, and they're doing like those old school like Christmas like shoots where like the photographer has you like sitting on your brother's
Yeah.
head or whatever, and they're like
No.
recreating it. So yeah, I'm a
Okay.
Jersey girl, so I'm a big
Okay.
mall outlet store.
Okay, afterwards, can you please email me that? Because I really want to see that. I
Yes.
am not on TikTok, so I did not know. Wow. Okay, yeah, right. Everything is so cyclical. I mean, I know, I feel like, there was like, I feel like in some ways it's like more democratic now. If you want to open a fashion company or fashion t-shirt company, you can just like, open an Instagram account and start selling directly. There's like less barriers to entry in some ways. So it's like more democratic than what it was with the old system. And I also think that like it's not needed as much for women. We have more opportunities. I mean, we're a greater percentage in colleges now than men. So I feel like it's a little bit, the world is different now,
Yeah.
but it's still good to have that view. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think about some of the things that you've talked about already and how innovative these women had to be in their time. And I think that innovation is something that is timeless. And I'm thinking about there's a Black female entrepreneur. She's like in the fashion space. I want to say she does like makeup or something. She recently did 1 million sales live on TikTok, and
Wow.
she's the first seller to do 1 million live on TikTok. So when I think about women like her and women in the workforce, I'm wondering, when you were writing this book, like who did you have in mind as the audience? Because this can be inspirational to so many people for so many different reasons.
Yeah, and I should say, like, as great as it was for women, there was a lot of, I mean, there was so much racism in the department stores. There was like, I write about how like Dorothy was one of the first women to actually hire African American saleswomen. Before that, like they were all kind of back of house working in, in the whatever, stock rooms and stuff. And that was 1942. And there's an article from like, I don't know what, I think it was like, I can't remember the newspaper, but one of the Lord and Taylor employees were like, yeah, it's great, we're doing this, but hey, we've got a quota. I mean, we can't go crazy here. So there was,
Mm,
you know what I mean? So it's like, it wasn't like a panacea or something. So yeah, being able to just directly market to your audience directly, like this woman you mentioned, like that's so empowering. And that was obviously not possible back then. And I think in many ways, it's much better now, in that example. Sorry, so I just wanted to say that. But what was your question?
who was the audience you had in mind when you were writing the
Oh,
book?
yeah. I mean, I was, like I said, I was thinking of my mom and like I guess her cohorts, but I mean, I do hope that younger women also find it, and men, actually, a reader just emailed me today or the other day about how he was a window dresser at Bendel's actually for Geraldine, and
What's a
he
window
had
dresser? For those of us,
What?
what's a window dresser for those of us who don't
Oh,
know?
sorry. So one of the amazing things about department stores back then, and maybe a little now, but not really, was their windows. It was basically like an art form. I mean, they were unlike anything that we know now. You know, it was like they even had like a thing in the 70s called street theater where they had like mannequins like overdosing in like, you know, I don't know, Balenciaga gowns and like all kinds of crazy, you know, they had Salvador Dali would do like windows. I mean, all these Georgia O'Keeffe, all these artists. It was like this whole creative endeavor, and the windows were really not, they weren't just, you know, here's a bunch of mannequins in clothes, you know, it was like a story. And so he was a young window dresser at Bendel's, and Bendel's had like the most, you know, the coolest windows. Okay. It was like very cutting edge. Like I mentioned, like the OD, there was like, you know, it was kind of a little risque and crazy, but like, yes, they had like, you know, it was like for Jean Muir, who was a designer back then, and they were all like mannequins overdosing in various stages. And, you know, it was like, you know, it would be a news story because it was kind of crazy. So anyway, he was talking about that, and he was saying, you know, you talk a lot about women in the book, but also for gay men, like this was a huge place for us. This was like a place where we could have creativity, we could, you know, be really successful, feel really at ease. So I think there's like a lot of, you know, narratives like that, you know. Anyway, but so I hope that, you know, like he felt inspired. You know, I think obviously young people who don't know about this world, who weren't around back then, hopefully will, you know, find it interesting. So I hope everybody reads it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see it being as inspirational to a lot of different audiences and a lot of people. So I share that sentiment. I hope everyone reads it. Um, so there's the book is actually filled with a lot of fun facts. You shared some of them already. I love that you have these other vignettes like sprinkled throughout the book with the overarching story of these three amazing women. But I wanted to know if you could tell us some more of these stories. You
Yeah.
know, why last Thursday in November is always Thanksgiving. You do have
Oh,
the party studio.
I know. Basically, so they could like extend the Christmas shopping, you know, the Christmas shopping season. But yeah, let's see. I mentioned mannequins. I have a really fun one about the woman who basically created mannequins, the story of how we have mannequins. And there was even like this guy in the 40s, for instance, who he was named Lester Gaba, and he created these new kind of mannequins. They were made out of plaster, and he did this like publicity stunt where he literally brought his mannequins to like the El Morocco nightclub. They called them his Gaba girls, and he was, you know, he took them to his nightclub. He went to like the king that you know, the wedding of King George when he absconded from the throne or whatever. He brought the mannequins to that wedding. He just like did all these things, these crazy things. I wrote about that. I wrote about like how basically actually Twiggy was the first model for the modern mannequin, and how that came about in London in the 60s, like the swinging 60s. You know, I have lots of different stories I can't think of right now, but you should read the book and find out.
I was gonna say, read the book and find out.
I mean, like one I just like thought of was we were talking about the windows, and actually like one of the architects of window design was this guy L. Frank Baum, who actually wrote The Wizard of Oz. He became an author afterward, but he created, like, he had a newsletter, a monthly newsletter on window design in like the 1890s, and he kind of like came up with the whole concept because he was in theater. So yeah, I don't know.
I love that. It's actually a perfect segue into our next audience question, which if we don't have any other questions, this will be our last question of the evening. So in your research, did you come across any stories of the subjects in your book crossing paths with Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein, whose rivalry in the cosmetics industry was famously showcased in the Broadway musical War Paint? This is juicy.
Yes,
You
that is
like you have the
actually
tea.
was
Tell
also a
us.
book. It's an amazing book. It was a book that came out a few years ago too, that like was about that rivalry. You know, obviously this was the same era as them, but it was kind of different business models. You know, the cosmetics industry, obviously they sold cosmetics at the at the department stores, but they were their own businesses, so it didn't totally interact. So I don't have any stories about them, but I wish I had the same kind of rivalry, because like what an amazing book idea and book. So and musical on the theater play, whatever. I think it was a musical. But no, they didn't come across particularly in my book. But it was certainly the same era and the same idea. I mean, they were also fierce entrepreneurial women who had amazing lives and who did a lot in the business world. So,
All of those industries are so cutthroat. Like there's so many stories,
oh my God.
watches, cosmetics, fashion.
Yes.
There's a
Yes.
lot of stories to be told there. Do
Yes.
you think your next book will stay in the same like?
No. I am done with that. I had a book idea, but I'm not sure now. So I'm still working it through with my agent and my editor. So I don't have anything specific to tell anyone now,
Well,
but hopefully I will.
we'll be here ready whenever you're ready.
All right.
Um,
Thank
so
you.
that wraps up all of our questions for the evening. This was amazing. I feel like I learned so much.
Thank you.
And your energy is so good. You're a breath of fresh air. And we're, as a fellow Columbia alum, like we're just so proud of you and congratulations on all
Oh,
the success
thanks.
and
Yeah, it's
all the
cool to
success
do
to
this.
come. Um,
Amazing.
so yeah, thank you, Julie, for an evening of learning. For all of our guests, you can and should buy Julie's book on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. We will be placing the link in the chat box, and it will also be emailed to you if you registered. On behalf of the Columbia alumni community, my deepest thanks to you and all of our attendees. Another big thank you to Julie for being with us this evening. We encourage you to stay involved and engage with the college community and to attend the many enriching events throughout the year. Be sure to follow Columbia College Women and our amazing partner on all of our social channels. And yeah, just stay in touch with us. I'm super excited to buy the book.
Thank
And to
you.
read it.
I appreciate it.
And then did you have any like closing words you wanted to give to everyone?
No, thank you so much. Yeah, I'd consider buying the book. I'd love it.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Bye.